If you look at your program, you'll see the last talk is by Carl Anderson from the Knights of Columbus. But Carl couldn't be with us because of a medical need in his family. And so he is going to be, Patrick Kelly, the Vice President for Public Policy of the Knights of Columbus, will be giving us the last address. The Knights of Columbus is the world's largest Catholic fraternal order. And Patrick, as I said, is head of public policy, but he does so much more than that. He does legislation, governmental affairs, and before his duty with the Knights of Columbus, he was in the U.S. State Department, where he was the senior advisor to the Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom, where in 2006 he earned the department's Superior Honor Award for his work on the new Iraqi Constitution. Prior to his work at the State Department, he served as the legislative counsel to the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence in the U.S. House of Representatives. Prior to that, he was in the Office of Intelligence with the National Security Division of the Department of Justice, where he practiced before the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. Mr. Kelly is a captain in the U.S. Navy Judge Advocate General's Corps. He currently serves in the reserves and just completed a tour of as the commanding officer of the International Law Unit of the U.S. Naval War College. The Knights of Columbus do amazing things, and I would love to tell you all of those, but I don't want to steal anything that Patrick's going to say. And we're just so glad that they're partners with us at the Religious Freedom Project. Join me in welcoming Patrick Kelly.
Yes, I bring greetings from Carl Anderson, who really regrets that he can't be here. I'm a poor substitute for him, of course, but it's a privilege for me to be with you today. As we come to the end of these important days, I would like to suggest that Dignitatis Humanae, the Second Vatican Council's Declaration on Religious Freedom, can address the global crisis of religious freedom in two significant ways. First, a greater understanding of Dignitatis Humanae can re-energize an appreciation for religious freedom in Western societies in a way that will enable them to respond to the global crisis of religiously motivated violence. And second, Dignitatis Humanae provides universal principles applicable to non-Western societies in a way that will enable Muslims and others to confront violent extremism among their co-religionists. The crisis of religious freedom that we have documented and heard about these past 3 days constitutes a humanitarian crisis of immense proportions. At root is a significant problem. Notwithstanding the official foreign policies of the United States, Canada, and the European Union, religious freedom itself is in decline throughout the West. This decline is encouraged by a toxic combination of increased government hostility toward religion, particularly toward Christianity, and a secularism that in many Western capitals can only be described as militant. The unfortunate result is that the Western governments that diminish religious freedom at home are now increasingly unwilling or unable to convince non-Western societies to respect religious freedom, even when the violations in those societies rise to the level of deadly persecution. Of course, Western governments still claim to believe in religious freedom, but the reality is that it is difficult to sell a product or an idea in which you no longer believe. Today, many officials of the United States government no longer profess an expansive notion of religious freedom or speak about it as did those who drafted the U.S. Bill of Rights, that is, as the first freedom of democracy, a freedom necessary for the flourishing of every human being and every society. The framers of the U.S. Constitution sought to protect an expansive notion of free exercise of religion. But many in government today are more inclined to speak of a narrowly defined freedom of worship. Increasing numbers of Westerners see religious freedom as a mere claim of privilege by religious people, or worse, by religious institutions. And they see this claim as one that should be limited by other, more important rights. And often, this limited view of religious freedom is accompanied by an expansive view of the government's right to determine what is permissible for religious communities to believe or practice. More troubling still is the perception, often advanced by militant secularists, that religion itself is not an expression of human flourishing, but to the contrary, is an impediment to freedom and well-being. For too many in the West, religion, particularly Christianity, is no longer seen as a solution to society's problems, but as the problem itself. And some in the West would have us proceed as though the only way to remove the threat of religious violence is to remove the influence of religion from society. This approach creates a twofold problem. First, the secular proposal of a godless society without the influence of faith is a non-starter with all of the world's great religions. Second, this proposal of a godless society appears to validate the claim of religious extremists who maintain that Western values are fundamentally hostile to religious belief. The first book of the Jewish and Christian scriptures makes it clear that every human being is created in the image and likeness of God. This is the foundation of our understanding of the dignity and equality of every person, and it is the starting point for Dignitatis Humanae. I would emphasize that the principles of human dignity, equality, and the rights of conscience, while developed in the West, did not originate in the West. They were not in the first instance Western. They were incorporated from a Middle Eastern Judeo-Christian outlook into Greek and Roman societies that had very different traditions. At a time of increasing globalization, those of us in the West would do well to reflect upon this historical fact, especially at a time when those Western nations, formed by the 2,000-year history of Christianity, are no longer willing or able to persuade non-Western nations of the intrinsic value of religious freedom. Pope Francis has been alone among the world leaders in using the term genocide to describe what is happening to Christians in Iraq and Syria. At the UN in September, he called for international action, and in a recent homily, he reminded us that this is happening before the whole world, with the complicit silence of many powerful leaders who could stop it. The persecution of Christians and other religious minorities in the Middle East meets the legal definition of genocide, but none except for the Pope is calling it by its true name. What then is to be done? First, we need to be realistic about the ideological disposition of many Western governments that renders them incapable of responding to the global crisis of religious freedom. And at the same time, we must work to make Dignitatis Humanae understood in the West. Second, we need to be realistic about both the necessity of military action in some cases and the limits of it in others. Confronted with mass murder, the international community must resoundingly demonstrate that violence will be contained, halted, and punished. We all know that while sustained military force can defeat terrorists and drive them from their caliphate, it is not sufficient, nor is it a long-term solution. This is because the cause of the crisis is not military, nor is it economic. The cause is a religious sensibility that insists upon violence. Military action cannot impose a solution because a solution cannot simply be imposed. Judaism, Islam, and Christianity have all shown that they cannot be forced to change their beliefs and practices from outside. Change of this magnitude can only come from within the faith community. Even today, Muslim thinkers in the Middle East who seek to address this question by integrating nonviolence into popular interpretations of the Quran are often blocked by anti-blasphemy, anti-apostasy, and anti-defamation laws, which ensure that their views cannot be heard in a sustained way. Following the Paris attacks, we saw many Muslims condemn terrorism and assert that Islam is a religion of peace. This is both brave and helpful. And perhaps Dignitatis Humanae provides a roadmap for those Muslims with the necessary learning and credibility needed to offer interpretations of the Quran and Hadith that counter those espoused by the extremists. Last week in Washington, D.C., a panel of Muslim public figures did just that. They agreed that Muslim thinkers and opinion makers must avoid deflection and must not deny that Islamic extremism is behind terrorism and human rights abuses. Rather, these thinkers must provide alternative interpretations of those verses in the Quran that fuel violence. The panel called upon Muslim communities to promote pluralistic values and an understanding of human rights consistent with the UN Declaration on Human Rights. Such an advancement of human rights by Muslims themselves would not only hearten non-Muslims in the West, but would more importantly have the necessary credibility that is the sine qua non of any successful reform. It would be foolish to underestimate the obstacles to this course, but it is heartening to know that Islam is not without resources of its own in developing doctrines of nonviolence and religious freedom. Our friend and our scholar, Daniel Philpott, has written of the seeds of freedom in Islam, which include the Quranic verse, "There is no compulsion in religion." There are also important seeds in some of the historical experiments of cultural interchange between Christians and Muslims, and there is the success of Muslim-majority countries like Senegal in moving toward religious freedom. And we tend to forget that in this cultural interchange, Christianity has proven historically capable of working with and even influencing Islam in a way that achieved greatness. Philip Jenkins has written of the Christian roots of the Arabic Golden Age, the fact that it was Christian scholars who transmitted Aristotle and the cultural inheritance of the ancient world, science, philosophy, and medicine, to centers like Baghdad and Damascus. The unanswered question is whether Western nations will have the will to encourage a new cultural interchange. And secondarily, whether Muslim leaders will have the courage to undertake the internal discussions necessary to begin a process of reform. And here is where Dignitatis Humanae can play a decisive role. As the Second Vatican Council acknowledged, the Catholic Church was late in developing its doctrine of religious freedom. Its experience in doing so, however, should provide a reason for hope for Muslims working to develop an Islamic idea of religious freedom. I would suggest 6 principles established in the Declaration that could assist both Western policymakers and reform-minded Muslims. First, religious freedom has staying power because it is a gift of God, not of the state. The right of religious freedom, said the Council Fathers, is known through the revealed Word of God and by reason itself. It is an inalienable right. Retrieving this fundamental idea, the very engine of Western democracy, will be critical to reviving the Western commitment to religious freedom. Second, to protect religious freedom is to protect its free exercise in public matters as well as private. Dignitatis Humanae teaches that injury is done to the human person and to the very order established by God for human life if the free exercise of religion is denied in society. And the great religions of the world are premised upon an insight that their faith community is not only called to a specific way of praying, but to a specific way of living. The notion of religious freedom that excludes the free exercise of religion and substitutes instead a narrow concept of freedom of worship is universally inadequate. Third, Religious freedom extends to religious communities and faith-based civil societies just as it does to individuals. The Declaration observes that the social nature of man requires that he should participate with others in matters religious, that he should profess his religion in community. Fourth, religious freedom does not mean an indifferentism that assumes all religions are the same or equally true. By linking religious freedom with each person's responsibility to seek the truth, Dignitatis Humanae grounds religious freedom at the very heart of human dignity and not simply as the consequence of a religious relativism. Fifth, all religious and faith-based communities have an equal right to make their respective claims in society. Notwithstanding its reaffirmation of the Catholic Church's centrality in the lives of men, the Declaration does not reassert a claim for a privileged position in the civil order. Instead, it affirmed the right of all religious communities, Christian and non-Christian, to equality in the civil order. The Declaration proposes for all faith-based communities a broad spectrum of civic rights, including the right to select and place clergy, to own property, to establish their own educational and charitable organizations. Sixth, the religious freedom asserted by Dignitatis Humanae has important limits. It is not a license for violence or any other act contrary to the moral law. This qualification is vital for Muslim-majority states that will have to balance the desire to give Islam a significant public role with the responsibility to guarantee freedom for religious minorities. Let me close by noting that when Dignitatis Humanae was promulgated at the Second Vatican Council in 1965, most Catholic-majority nations, such as Spain, Chile, and the Philippines, had authoritarian governments that were widely believed to be incapable of protecting the rights of non-Catholic citizens and religious groups. But during the ensuing decades, the world witnessed what Samuel Huntington called the third wave of democratization, in which many of these Catholic nations began the transition from authoritarianism to free and stable societies. Huntington and others have identified Dignitatis Humanae as one of the necessary catalysts to this transition. Encouraged by the great apostle of religious freedom, St. John Paul II, who, as a young cardinal, significantly influenced the drafting of Dignitatis Humanae, Catholic-majority nations the world over began to embrace its principles. A document like Dignitatis Humanae could not have been written just 100 years before, yet the Catholic Church saw its view on religious freedom develop substantially in just over a century. In his book, The Principles of Catholic Theology, Joseph Ratzinger spoke of Dignitatis Humanae as among the texts of the Second Vatican Council that provided a kind of counter-syllabus to the 19th century syllabus of errors. If Catholic thought in this area can so develop, it is not unreasonable to hope and suggest that other religions could see similar developments of thought as well. How religion can engage in a constructive dialogue with itself is something Christianity has pioneered and can help others to do as well. In this way, Dignitatis Humanae can be a document of hope, not only for its theological contributions and policy implications, but for its historical importance, as a document that charted a course few might have considered just a century before. If today Catholicism can condemn the concept of violence in the name of religion, there is no reason that other religions cannot do the same. Islam, it is true, has no pope or magisterium to take the lead in moving toward religious freedom. What Muslims do have is two competing visions of Islam, a religion of peace and a religion of violent jihad. One of those visions will eventually triumph over the other, but it is an open question as to which. Addressing this dichotomy is one of the great issues of our day, both for the Muslim majority world and the Christian-formed West. If we do not work together, the results will be catastrophic in terms of human lives. Today we benefit from the leadership of Pope Francis, who has had the courage to speak of a Christian genocide in the Middle East, has condemned violence in the name of religion, and has advocated for greater religious freedom and conscience rights in the West. We might all ask ourselves whether we have done enough to add our voices to his. As we celebrate its 50th anniversary, Dignitatis Humanae provides us with a unique platform from which to address both the East and the West. We might consider that it creates an intellectual space in which all persons of goodwill can meet, find common ground, and affirm a common dignity. Perhaps working together in a spirit of goodwill, Christians and Muslims can create a second Arabic golden age, as they did centuries ago. Thank you.